हाय एवरीवन, वेलकम टू सक्सेस ड्रीम पाथ। आज की क्लास में हम लोग कंप्यूटर का 2500 प्लस क्वेश्चन आंसर का सीरीज पार्ट 3 करने जा रहे हैं। तो चलिए स्टार्ट करते हैं। चैप्टर 3 ऑपरेटिंग सिस्टम। क्वेश्चन नंबर 6 to 1 से व्हाट इज एन ऑपरेटिंग सिस्टम? सिस्टम सॉफ्टवेयर विच सॉफ्टवेयर acts as an interface between user and hardware. Operating system, which operating system is developed by Microsoft Windows? Which OS is open source? Linux. Which OS is used in Apple computer? macOS. Which OS is used in smartphones? Android. Which OS manages computer hardware? Operating system. Which OS is an example of multi-user OS? Unix. Which OS supports multitasking? Windows. Which OS supports multiprocessing? Linux. Which OS executes program one at a time? Single tasking OS. Which OS executes multiple programs simultaneously? Multitasking OS. Which OS allow multiple user at the same time? Multi-user OS. Which OS is used in real-time system? RTOS. What is the full form of RTOS? Real-time operating system. Which OS is used in embedded system? RTOS. Which OS is used in server? Linux. Which OS controls memory management? Operating system. Which OS controls processing scheduling? Operating system. Which OS feature allocates CPU time? Scheduling. Which OS component manages files? File system. Which OS components manage memory? Memory manager. Which OS component manages process manager? Which OS components handles input output devices? Input output manager. Which OS loads first when computer starts? Operating system. What is the process of starting OS called booting? Which memory leads OS into memory? Bootstrap loader. Which memory stores bootstrap program? ROM. Which OS feature protects system resources security? Which OS feature manage user access authentication? Which OS supports graphical interface? Windows. Which OS uses command line interface? Unix. Which OS file system is used by Windows NTFS? Which OS file system is used by Linux ext4? Which OS supports virtual memory? Linux. Which OS handles deadlock management? Operating system. Which OS feature avoids deadlock prevention? Which OS feature detects deadlock detection? Which OS type is used in ATMs? RTOS. Which OS schedules jobs in batch processing? Batch operating system. Which OS is used in mainframe computer? Unix. Which OS is used in supercomputers? Linux. Which OS supports time sharing? Time sharing OS. Which OS allocates time slices to process? Time sharing OS. Which OS supports job scheduling? Batch OS. Which OS supports resource allocation? Operating system. Which OS controls hardware interrupts? Operating system. Which OS provides device drivers? Operating system. Which OS manages disk scheduling? Operating system. Which OS ensures fairness in CPU usage? Time sharing OS. Which OS component handles CPU scheduling? Scheduler. Which scheduling algorithm executed first come process first? FCFS. What is the full form of FCFS? First come first serve. Which scheduling algorithm gives minimum average waiting time? SJF. What is the full form of SJF? Shortest job first. Which scheduling algorithm uses time quantum round robin? Which scheduling algorithm is primitive round robin? What is the full form of RR round robin? Which scheduling algorithm is non-preemptive FCFC? Which OS concept deals with execution of programs process? What is a process program in execution? Which OS structure store process information? PCB. What is the full form of PCB? Process control block. PCB. Which PCB field stores process state? Process state. Which PCB field stores CPU register? Register information. Which OS concept allow multiple processes? Multiple programming. Which OS technique improves CPU utilization? Multi-programming. Which OS state means process is ready to execute? Ready state. Which OS state means process is currently executing? Running state. Which OS state means process is waiting for input output? Waiting state. Which OS state means process has finished execution? Terminated state. Which OS concept creates a new process? Process creation. Which OS call terminates the process? Exit. Which OS concept allow communication between processes? IPS. What is the full form of IPS? Can you guess? Inter-process communication. Which IPS method uses is shared memory? Shared memory. Which IPS method uses message passing? Message passing. Which OS problem occurs when processes wait forever? Deadlock. Which deadlock condition requires circular waiting? Circular wait. Which deadlock condition requires exclusive resource use? Mutual exclusion. Which deadlock condition holds resources while waiting? Hold and wait. Which deadlock condition means no force release, no preemption? Which OS technique avoid deadlock? Deadlock avoidance. Which algorithm is used for deadlock avoidance? Banker's algorithm. Which who proposed Banker's algorithm? Dijkstra. Which OS technique ignores deadlock? Ostrich approach. Which OS technique detect deadlock after occurrence? Deadlock lock detection. Which OS resource can cause deadlock? CPU. Which OS resource is non-primitive? Printer. Which OS concepts manage concurrent execution? Concurrency. Which OS problem occur due to improper syno, synchronization race condition? Which OS mechanism ensures synchronization? Semaphore. What is the full form of CPU? Central Processing Unit. ये तो सबको पता होगा CPU का full form. Which OS concept controls critical section assess mutual exclusion? Which OS primitive is used in semaphore wait and single? Which OS mechanism locks shared resources? Mutex. Which OS supports multi-threading? Linux. Which OS concept divides process into threads? Multi-threading. Which thread shares process resources? User thread. Which OS feature improves responsiveness? Multi-threading. What is a thread? Lightweight process. Which thread is managed by OS kernel? Kernel thread. Which thread is managed by user level library? User thread. Which model maps many user thread to one kernel thread? Many to one. Which model maps one user thread to one kernel thread? One to one. Which model maps many user thread to many kernel thread, many to many? Which thread model is used by Linux 1 to 1? Which thread model blocks all thread on system call many to 1? Which thread model provides true parallelism 1 to 1? Which OS concepts manages thread management? Which OS structure stores thread information TCB? What is the full form of TCB? Thread control block. Which scheduling is applied to thread CPU scheduling? Which OS of problem occurs when low priority blocks high priority inversion? Which OS technique solve priority inversion, priority inheritance? Which OS concept manages main memory management? Which memory allocation method uses fixed partitions, fixed partitioning? Which memory allocation method uses variable partitions, dynamic partitioning? Which allocation strategy uses first free block, first fit? Which allocation strategy uses smallest sufficient block, best fit? Which allocation strategy uses largest block, worst fit? Which memory allocation strategy minimizes leftover space, waste fit? Which memory problem occur due to variable partitions, external fragmentation? Which technique removes external fragmentation, compaction? Which memory technique shifts processes in memory compaction? Which memory technique loads only needed page demand paging? Which OS fault occur if page is absent in memory page fault? Which memory management structure stores page status page table? Which bit indicates page is modified dirty bit? Which bit indicates page is recently used reference bit? Which OS component manages secondary storage file system? Which OS concept organizes data into files, file management? Which OS structure stores file metadata inode? Which file system concept store file permissions inode? Which file system is used in Unix UFC? Which file system supports journaling in Linux ext4? Which file system is used in Windows by default NTFS? Which file system supports large files NTFS? Which OS concept provides hierarchical file structure directory? Which directory contains user files home directory? Which directory is root of file system root directory? Which file system structure stored directly in trace directory table? Which OS supports file locking Linux? Which OS ensure file protection operating system? Which OS mechanism controls controls file access control? Which file access method reads file sequentially sequential access? Which file access method read file randomly direct access? Which file allocation method uses linked list linked allocation? Which file allocation method uses contiguous blocks contiguous allocation? Which file allocation method uses index block index allocation? Which file allocation method avoids external fragmentation index allocation? Which file allocation method is fastest for sequential access contiguous allocation? Which OS structure stores free disk blocks free space list? Which free space management technique uses bit vector bitmap? Which OS concept manage disk space, disk management? Which OS algorithm decides order of disk access, disk scheduling? Which disk scheduling algorithm service request in order FC? Which disk scheduling algorithm reduces seek time SSTF? What is the full form of SSTF? Shortest seek time first. Which disk scheduling algorithm moves head in one direction only? A scan. Which disk scheduling algorithm is also called elevator algorithm? A scan. Which disk scheduling algorithm is circular scan? CS scan. Which disk scheduling algorithm service end then reverses a scan? Which disk scheduling algorithm provides uniform wait time? C scan. Which disk scheduling algorithm scan one direction then jumps back? C scan. Which disk scheduling algorithm is improved? Scan look. Which disk scheduling algorithm is circular look? C look. Which OS concept manage input output devices? Input output management. Which OS component controls device communication? Device driver. Which OS software translate OS command to hardware signals? Device driver. Which OS mechanism improves input output performance? Buffering. Which OS technique uses main memory to hold input output data temporarily? Buffering. Which OS technique overlaps input output and CPU operations? Spooling. What is the full form of a spool? Simultaneous peripheral operations online. Which OS concept uses disk as buffer? Spooling. Which OS technique reduces CPU idle time? Spooling. Which OS mechanism temporarily store input output data? Buffer. Which OS mechanism uses queue for input output request? I input output queue. Which OS technique allows as as asynchronous input output interrupts? Which OS concept signals CPU about input output completion interrupt? Which OS mechanism allow direct memory access? DMA. What is the full form of DMA? Direct memory access. Which OS component manages DMA operations? DMA controller. Which OS technique bypasses CPU for data transfer? DMA. Which OS mechanism increases input output throughput? DMA. Which OS concept manages system protection? Which OS feature prevents unauthorized access? Security. Which OS mechanism verifies user identity authentication? Which OS mechanism controls user permission authorization? Which OS attacks flood system resource? OS attacked flood system resource denial of service. Which OS attack pretends to be a legitimate user spoofing? Which OS attack captures network packets sniffing? Which OS concept ensure data confidentially encryption? Which OS concept ensures data integrity? Which OS concept ensures system availability? Which OS security model is CIA tried confidentiality, integrity, and availability? Which OS mechanism logs system events auditing? Which OS mechanism monitors resource usage accounting? Which OS concept ensure fairness among users scheduling? Which OS feature supports system reliability, fault tolerance? Which OS feature allows system recovery after failure, fault recovery? Which OS technique keeps system running despite failures, fault tolerance? Which OS mechanism saves system state periodically, checkpointing? Which OS concept restarts system from last checkpoint, rollback recovery? Which OS mechanism detects hardware errors, error detection? Which OS mechanism corrects detected error automatically, error correction? Which OS features ensures data consistency after crash? Journaling. Which file system uses journaling ext4? Which OS concept manage distributed resources? Distributed OS. Which OS runs on multiple computer connected by network? Distributed OS. Which OS provides transparent resource sharing? Distributed OS. Which OS is designed for network service? Network OS. Which example is Windows Server? Network OS. Which OS allows remote login? Network OS. Which OS concept supports load balancing? Distributed OS. Which OS is designed for mobile devices? Mobile OS. Which mobile OS is developed by Google Android? Which mobile OS is developed by Apple iOS? Which OS supports touch-based interface mobile OS? Which OS device power efficiently in device mobile OS? Which OS feature controls battery usage power management? Which OS schedules tasks to save power? Mobile OS. Which OS concept manages energy consumptions? Power management. Which OS supports sandboxing for apps and Android? Which OS feature isolates applications? Sandboxing. Which OS concept ensures application security, application isolation? Which OS uses permission for app access, Android? Which OS feature restricts unauthorized app behavior, security policy? Which OS concept support virtualization, hypervisor? Which OS layer runs virtually machines hypervisor? Which hypervisor runs directly on hardware type 1 hypervisor? Which hypervisor runs on host OS type 2 hypervisor? Which OS technology allows multiple OS on one machine? Virtualization. Which OS feature improves resource utilization in virtualization, resource sharing? Which OS concept support content containerization, OS level virtualization? Which OS technology is used by Docker containerization? Which OS feature isolate containers namespace? Which OS feature controls container resource C groups? Which OS supports cloud computing infrastructure Linux? Which OS feature supports scalability distributed processing? Which OS concepts allow elastic resource allocation? Cloud OS. Which OS is used in cloud servers? Linux. Which OS features ensure high availability? Failover. Which OS mechanisms uses to backup system automatically failover? Which OS concept reduces downtime, high availability? Which OS feature supports system monitoring? Which OS tool track performance metrics, performance monitor? Which OS system helps in capacity planning, resource monitoring? Which OS mechanism records system activities, logging? Which OS concept completes system management, system administration? Which OS concept manages user accounts, user management? Which OS features assigns user privileges, authorization? Which OS mechanism verifies login credential authentication? Which OS concept separates user from each other, user isolation? Which OS supports role-based access control? Linux. Which OS file stores user password hashes /etc/shadow? Which OS file stores user account details /etc/password? Which OS command is used to add a new user add? Which OS command is used to delete a user del? Which OS command changes file permission chmod? C. Which OS command changes file ownership chown? Which OS permission allows file execute? Which OS permission allow file modification write? Which OS permission allows file viewing read? Which OS concept groups user together group management? Which OS files stores group information /etc/group? Which OS command displays disk user df? Which OS command display directly size du? Which OS command monitors running processes top? Which OS command shadows process id ps? Which OS command terminates a process kill? Which OS signal forcefully terminates process cig kill? Which OS command shuts down system immediately shut down? Which OS command reboot system reboot? Which OS concept manage system startup services init system? Which init system is used in modern Linux system? And which OS concept manage background service daemon? Which OS service runs continuously in background daemon? Which OS concept schedules system job scheduling? Which OS command schedules task at a fixed time cron? Which OS file stores cron jobs cron tab? Which OS concept manage system time management? Which OS command displays current date and time date? Which OS concept handles software installation package management? Which package manager is used in Ubuntu apt? Which package manager is used in Red Hat Linux yum? Which OS concept manages updates and patch management? Which OS feature improves system stability, regular update? Which OS concept manage hardware abstraction hull? What is the full form of HAL? Hardware abstractions layer. Which OS concept ensures portability? Hardware abstraction. Which OS feature supports backward compatibility mode? Which OS concept manage system configuration file configuration management? Which OS directly store configuration file in Linux/etc? Which OS concept ensures system maintainability, system administration? Which OS role manages user and permission, system administrator? Which OS feature records security events auditing? Which OS mechanism helps in forensic analysis logs? Which OS concept ensures compilation policy information enforcement? Which OS concept completes operating system study? OS administration. तो चलिए यहाँ पे आपका पार्ट 3 कंप्लीट होता है। इम्पॉर्टेंट है, आप फिर से देखिएगा, याद करिएगा, आपका एग्जाम में एक भी क्वेश्चन छूटेगा नहीं, आप दोबारा पढ़ लेंगे तो। चलिए तो पार्ट 4 में मिलेंगे। थैंक यू फॉर वॉचिंग। लाइक शेयर एंड सब्सक्राइब।